So the topic is very appropriate for the death of the season, as it were. You may recall that we started the season with the discussion on debt. So this is not to be confused with, there might be sort of debt-related aspects to death, but that's not the focus today. This is about defining death. And we are very happy to have two prominent speakers on this from very different disciplinary perspectives, as it were. Hannu, Sariola, Professor of Developmental Biology, with a medical, as it were, perspective, and Sami Pihlström, philosopher, Director of the Collegium for Advanced Study, representing the humanistic or philosophical point of view. I just want to share some sort of advertising observations in a few minutes before I give the floor to our two speakers. About defining death, we have multiple definitions, from very sort of natural scientific to something very commonsensical, like death defined as an irreversible end of brain activity due to total, and there you go, with some jargon in natural science, biology and all that, to a very commonsensical idea of death amounting to the end of memory traces about the person. Somebody lives as long as there is somebody else to remember that person and things of that kind. Now here is one question that our speakers might address or might not, I don't know. Is defining life a necessary or even a sufficient condition for defining death? How is the concept of life related to that of death? Just a few observations about the cultural importance of death. This was something that I sort of was quite fascinated about when I started finding about it. It's not only the case that there is cultural variation in dealing with death and including defining death. That's something we know about. Cultural anthropologists have informed us about this kind of cultural variation, but also that there would be no human culture at all without the inevitability of death. Human culture is dependent on death. If we were immortal, we wouldn't have culture. So here's a choice. If we were to want to be immortal, we wouldn't have culture. If we want to have culture, we need to die, and we need to be aware of that. Dying, in this sense, death is a necessary condition of the emergence and existence of culture. Here are some very juicy and elegant passages from Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist. Culture is the sediment of the ongoing attempt to make the living with the awareness of mortality livable. If by any chance we were to become immortal, culture would grind to a halt. It was precisely the knowledge of having to die, of the non-negotiable brevity of time, of the possibility or likelihood of visions remaining unfulfilled, projects unfinished, and things not done, that spurred humans into action and human imagination into flight. I wonder how far this sort of applies, or how closely this applies to sort of academic people like us, or whether it's equally applicable to just anyone, but I'm sure it applies to people like we. It was that knowledge that made cultural creation a necessity and turned humans into creatures of culture. The engine of culture was the need to fill the habits, separating transience from eternity, finitude from infinity, mortal life from immortality. This, I think, is somewhat interesting. I have no idea whatsoever whether our speakers will address issues of this kind, but it is part of the larger set of questions for sure. Now, death surely plays a causal role in the structure of the world in many ways. It's caused by other things such as poverty, famine, medical mistreatment, murder, traffic accident, disease, etc. Some of them more proximate, some of them less so. And death itself is a cause of many, many other things, such as suggested of culture, sorrow, of the collapse of an organization, etc., etc., etc. And now one of the interesting questions that our speakers again might or might not address is whether defining death is completely independent of its roles in the causal structure of the world, natural or social. I mean, these two things, defining what death is and placing death in the causal structure of the world, are these two entirely independent tasks, or are they somehow related to one another? And then yet another observation, sometimes, at least for some purposes, it's probably important to make a distinction between defining and detecting. It seems that in some of the background readings, for instance, that were supplied, there was no clear distinction between these two things, but at least for some purposes it seems a useful distinction to make. So defining is a matter of answering the question, what is death? Rather than what causal roles does death play as a cause or as an effect. We have the idea of defining death either directly or defining the concept of death, and thereby indirectly defining death. And then it's another kind of thing to detect or help detect death by specifying the indicators that then serve as criteria for detecting instances of death, or specifying criteria for applying the concept of death, and then applying those criteria in actual concept use. So this might be something that may, and I hope will, emerge in the discussion in the next few minutes. So, and finally I'll list the questions that already have been put forth in the announcements of this event. So these questions are supposed to be answered, or at least dealt with or touched upon by our two speakers, so as to keep this discussion organized. Can death be defined in the first place? Is this a possible endeavor or something impossible? What kinds of definition are available? There are many, many kinds of definition available. What kinds are those? How do the definitions differ? What do they share? So comparing those definitions with one another, identifying similarities, identifying differences between them. Then the question of what sort of purposes those different definitions might serve, and if they serve different purposes, what consequences this might have for our assessments of those definitions. Do those definitions compete with one another, or are they complementary? So do we need to choose between them? Choose one instead of another? Or can we have them all, provided they all serve some useful purposes? And finally, what would have to be discovered for us to formulate the general theory of life and death? I think this was your proposal for inclusion in this list, so we are eager to learn from you about this issue. All right, so these are the questions, and now we are very, very keen to learn about the answers to these questions by our two speakers, and Hannu Sariola will start, and Sami will